Welcome back, everybody. Now that you know something about evolution and how it works, and how speciation occurs, and therefore how the Earth's biodiversity has come to be, it's important to say something about scientific naming. It's pretty obvious that from a scientific point of view, all species of organisms need a name. And further, all organisms have differing degrees of similarity, and therefore it seems obvious that you can group them into increasingly inclusive categories. And those categories also require a name. So, for example, beetles are a kind of insect. Insects are related to other species that have an external skeleton and are thus called arthropods. And all arthropods are animals. Those are increasingly large categories that are official names of these groups of organisms. So the process by which organisms are named and classified is known as taxonomy, and that's a word you need to know. Modern taxonomy was founded by a Swedish scientist named Carolus Linnaeus, who worked in the middle of the 18th century. And I'm going to tell you a little about him. Here's a picture of him. And he lived from 1707 to 1778. And in 1735, he began publishing a very influential book called Systema Naturae, in which it was his desire to describe all of the species in the world. He had no idea that there were at a minimum 2 million species of plants and animals. But he was up to the task and taking it on. And he was a very highly acclaimed scientist during his day. He's holding a flower in his hand, and that flower actually is named for him. It's named Linnea borealis, or the twin flower. So here are the rules we have today which derive from Linnaeus's methodology. First, in order to name a species, it must be formally described in a paper that is published in a scientific journal. So in other words, a journal has to accept it. Second, the specimen on which the describer based the name or based the description must be designated as a type species and placed in a museum. So, for example, the Smithsonian here has thousands of type specimens, and that individual bears the name for that species. The species must be given a Latin binomial, which means a two-word name, and it must be Latin. So, for example, Turdus migratorius. The first name is known as the genus to which the species belong, and the second name is known as the species epithet. The first name is capitalized, the second one is not. The first name is usually a noun, and the second is an adjective that describes it. So, Turdus migratorius, Turdus means thrush in Latin, and migratorius means that it is the migrating thrush, and it indeed refers to our American robin, which is a migratory species. In Linnaeus's day, and up until very recently, species were grouped together in these hierarchical categories that imply relationship, and all species occur within a genus, and a genus may contain one or more members, and all genera are then put into a family, and all families are contained within an order, etc. And the hierarchy is domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And it's a task of all ninth grade biology students to memorize that order. And in order to do that, you can get a mnemonic device to remember the order of these, such as dumb kids playing chess on freeways get squashed. Or the more traditional one, dear King Philip came over from Germany and stayed. Each of these groups is known as a taxon. So, for example, a phylum is a taxon, a family is a taxon, a genus is a taxon, or a species is a taxon. It's the word we use to talk about a taxonomic category. And the plural of taxon is taxa. So, let's look at humans and how they're classified. And we're going to start down here at the bottom. And we see that humans are in the genus Homo, and they're the species sapiens. So we are Homo sapiens, and that literally means the wise man. We're in the family Hominidae. We're in the order Primates. We're in the class Mammals. We're in the phylum Chordata, and we're in the kingdom Animals, and we're in the domain Eukaryota. Just a little bit about what This means the order Primates contains all monkeys. The class Mammalia contains all mammals, all things that have fur and lactate, produce milk. The phylum Chordata relates to the presence of a backbone, including some backbones that are not vertebrae. The kingdom Animalia refers to things that are animal-like, and the domain Eukaryota refers to things that have a eukaryotic cell type. The domain is the most general, so in this graphic you can see that there are a lot of organisms in the eukarya, but only 2 organisms in the genus Panthera, and only 1, the leopard, is Panthera pardus in this diagram. So the domain is the most general and the species is the most specific. Species specific, you get the connection. Linnaeus invented his system without understanding evolution. And under Linnaeus's system, the more similar 2 species are, the more closely related they must be. Thus, members of the same genus are more similar to each other than members of the same family, etc., etc. And so for this reason, turtles, lizards, snakes, alligators, and crocodiles have traditionally been classified as reptiles, which is a class, because they are all scaly and cold-blooded, they lay eggs, and they're quadrupeds. Whereas birds, which are warm-blood, have feathers and wings, were in their own class, aves. Similarly, gorillas, orangs, chimpanzees have more similarities with each other than with humans, and thus were classified together in the same family, and humans were placed in a different family. So, as we shall see, the evolutionary evidence suggests that both of these classification schemes are in error. The addition of evolution to taxonomy is called systematics. And so systematics is the study of the evolutionary relationships between organisms and then naming them in ways that are consistent with the evolutionary history. Systematics uses homology to search for common ancestry by constructing evolutionary trees. And these evolutionary trees are also referred to as phylogenies. And I'll use both words, that's why I want you to know that. And you've already seen how to do that in our Race Through the Woods exercise. Since evolution has occurred over billions of years and involves many millions and millions of adaptations, the idea that all life can be categorized into 8 Linnaean categories is obviously a flaw, right? It's way too few categories. And yet, the Linnaean system is still useful, but really can't contain the complexity of evolution. So let's talk generally about how phylogenies or evolutionary trees are made. This is a bit of a review for you. We look at the traits of existing organisms or fossils and infer when they must have evolved by looking at which organisms have them. And if you have fossils, they have dates in the fossil records, so you can put a date to it. A derived character shared by several taxa is evidence that these taxa are related through a common ancestor that first evolved that derived character, because it's more likely that the trait evolved once than independently many times. For example, vertical plates and or spikes growing down the back defines a group called Stegosauria, of which there are 3 known fossil species that all have that. In contrast, there's a whole nother group of organisms in this group of dinosaurs that have body covered with horizontal armored plates set in crosswise row. And all these dinosaurs, and you may remember some of these from your toys when you were younger, such as Euplocephalus and Ankylosaurus or Sauropelta or Edmontonia, they're all kind of popular these days in dinosaur sets. Now, an evolutionary tree, therefore, consists of clades. So what's a clade? A clade is a common ancestor and all of its descendants. So you can see here the red box outlines a clade, this common ancestor and its 2 descendants. The yellow box is another clade, which I call clade 2 here. This common ancestor and its 4 descendants. And then the big blue clade is this common ancestor and its 8 descendants. So a clade is a common ancestor and all of its descendants. 3 clades are shown here. And notice that clades are nested within each other. And that allows us to give meaning to the names we provide. We could name this a big inclusive clade by one name, and then this more selective one by another, and this one by another. And we could call this the genus, and this the family, and this the class or the order, let's say. A good question for you to figure out is how many clades are actually shown here? That's a good little exercise if you like puzzles. So systematics is thus the task of identifying clades. And it seems reasonable to insist that the names of groups of organisms should refer to clades. And so let's take a look at what that means. So clades are identified by looking for the groups that share the most derived characters. That means the derived homologies. Now, reversals and characters that evolve more than once therefore create confusion. Can you see why? Because they appear to be shared derived characters or homologous characters, but they are in fact not. So therefore we have to use computer programs to determine the best evolutionary tree that can be produced by a data set. And it is up to the taxonomist to figure out what characters to look at and how to score them, and then put them into the computer program to see what the best trees are. Historically, many groups have been based only on similarity. So what we find now is that some named taxonomic groups are not true clades. They don't contain an ancestor and all of its descendants. Let's take a look at two examples of this. Birds and reptiles have traditionally been placed in separate classes. Aves for birds, reptilia for reptiles. However, the phylogeny of life is shown here, where you can see that the sister group to birds are the crocodiles. And you saw this in Race Through the Woods. And you saw the reason for it there. And since they're the most commonly related, that means that the common ancestor of all reptiles is also the common ancestor of birds. So this means birds are in fact reptiles, even though they haven't been thought of that way historically. Why are birds so different from the other reptiles? Because their rate of evolution through the dinos and birds was incredibly fast. And part of that had to do with the fact that they became aerial, and they opened up a lot of niche opportunity to be exploited by this group of organisms. And they evolved rapidly in many different directions. In the rest of the reptiles, change has been much slower. Here is another example. Traditionally, the great apes have been placed in one family and the humans have been placed in another family because humans look very different from the rest of the great apes. However, the best phylogeny shows that humans are most closely related to chimps and that the evolutionary tree actually looks like this. So humans can't really be put in their own family because the common ancestor of the gorillas and the chimpanzees is also a common ancestor of humans. How do we resolve this? Named groups must be clades, and clades are then named. So that's the idea. We're going to name clades, and we're not going to really care so much about whether they're families or genera, etc., etc. We're going to name the clades. And you're already familiar with this idea because we've been using the term vertebrates, which is the name of the clade of all the organisms with a backbone. And what do you think the clade amniotes refers to? I'll leave you to ponder that question. So the Linnaean categories are still useful when discussing groups of organisms, such as all birds. It's very useful to be able to split them into equivalent ranks, such as families or orders. So let's see how we resolve the bird and human naming issues. There are two possible ways. If birds are to remain a distinct class, then turtles must be its own class, so must snakes and lizards, so must crocs and alligators. So let's look at this. If birds are to remain a class, then crocodiles have to be a class because here's the common ancestor of birds and all its descendants. Here's the common ancestor of crocodiles and all its descendants. Here's the common ancestor of snakes and lizards and all its descendants. Here, the common ancestor of turtles. So they can all four be their own classes. Or we make them all into reptiles. It doesn't really matter which they are. There's no scientific way to determine this. It's just a matter of preference. Now, if humans are in their own family, then so too must each of the others have their own family. So let's look at the diagram for that. If humans are in their family, then chimps must be in their own family, gorillas must be in their own family, and orangutans must be in their own family. Or humans could be lumped into the family with the other great apes, and that's what's done by most biologists these days. Hominidae is that family. That's it for today. I hope what you've gained from this is an understanding that taxonomy, which is the naming and classifications of organisms, needs to be justified with the evolutionary history. And I hope you can see some of the problems that have arisen and how they can be resolved. Next time, we're going to look at the evolutionary tree of all life in the broadest categories. Until then, go outside, look at nature, and ask biological questions, and I'll see you soon.